I'll give some specific stories and examples of current cases. I'll be focusing mainly on American cases, partly because the law in this area is very well developed, but the cases themselves, the practical examples, I believe can point to a broader conceptual problem in the way that we approach human rights conflicts in general. So I'll start with a story, and I'll end with a story. In 2006, Michael Morales was sitting on death row in California. He was sentenced to death for raping and murdering a 17-year-old girl. By then, in 2006, he was 2 hours away from execution, and the execution never happened. To this day, he still sits on death row in California. 2 federal courts had approved the lethal injection protocol with which the state planned to end the convicted murderer's life. And that protocol required the presence of physicians to monitor Morales and ensure that he was not subjected to unnecessary pain. Instead, both of the court-appointed anesthesiologists refused to take part in the execution, and they cited ethical concerns. They could not participate in taking a human life. The American Medical Association is a professional organization. Its code of ethics states, "A physician as a member of a profession dedicated to preserving life when there is hope of doing so should not be a participant in a legally authorized execution." Today, Morales, as I said, continues to live on death row, and the state searches for a constitutional legal injection protocol. Now, the death penalty is mandated as a matter of law in the United States, and as Professor Tyrone brought up, this creates quite a few tensions between people in different professions, particularly the more closely they're associated with public services, that are supported by the state and what are purportedly state interests. Now, this case didn't center on the constitutionality or the ethics of the death penalty. It was simply a matter of administration. California could not find an acceptable means to meet its ends. But what's interesting about it is really from the perspective of the doctors. Should the government be allowed to force the anesthesiologists to participate in the execution? And do the doctors have a right to refuse to participate in killing? Do citizens not guided by professional codes of ethics or even by explicit religious expressions of what they may and may not do in specific circumstances have such a right in general? And if they do in the realm of the death penalty, what about other forms of killing? Dr. Tyrone mentioned military service and abortion. I believe that my colleague here will be talking about euthanasia and assisted suicide. I'm going to argue that cases of conscientious objection in the health arena necessarily implicate complete understandings of the human person, complete moral codes and worldviews, which explains why these tensions can be so fraught. And I'll talk about the interplay between that understanding and the technical tools that we have in the law to face such questions. So the law answers such questions in a very specific technical way, which I'll describe very briefly. But there's a lot more going on than some of these technical expressions can actually express. So very briefly, the legal standard in the United States for deciding questions such as this is actually very similar to the European one. It's essentially a balancing test. Some people call it a 3-part test, others call it a 2-part test. It doesn't really matter. I won't get into those technicalities now. But it's basically an interest balancing test. On the one hand, the court looks at whether or not conscientious objectors' interest has been substantially burdened, whether their religious rights have been substantially burdened. And on the other hand, it looks at the government's interest in whatever public policy the government is defending. So there might be a religious person who applies to the court for an exception on the basis of religious belief, And the exception challenges a law that presumably expresses some sort of public or interest or common good. Another part of the test, which is why sometimes you see people say that it's 3 instead of 2 parts, is something called least restrictive means. So let's say the court says, well, there's a substantial burden, but the government has a compelling interest, and that compelling interest wins out. So the government's compelling interest in enforcing its criminal laws are just more important than whatever religious interests you bring to the court. You still have to show, government, that the means with which you're doing it is the least restrictive means for achieving your goal. This all probably sounds pretty abstract unless you're a lawyer, so I'll give you an example. This is a case from last year that my firm litigated called Hobby Lobby. It involved a family-owned business, a very large business, but it was privately held, owned entirely by a family. They happened to be very socially conscientious. They were very well known for being good employers, for example. They paid a lot more than the minimum wage required to their lowest level employee. They had an excellent health benefits plan. But they faced a conflict once the Affordable Care Act was passed by President Obama's administration. Because the Affordable Care Act mandated that certain drugs had to be provided by healthcare insurance plans. So in America, almost all healthcare is provided through insurance that goes through the employer. It's tied to your job. When you have a job, the employer provides insurance, and that's how you get your healthcare benefits. In this case, the owners of Hobby Lobby happened to be very devout Christians, and the provision of the law that they objected to was a provision that mandated that every form of birth control that was legally available through the approval of the Food and Drug Administration had to be included in the plans. So in many other areas of health, that was not the case. The plans could cover some, but not all drugs for, say, Parkinson's disease or certain kinds of cancers. But in terms of contraception, they required all of the drugs. The Greens, the family that owned Hobby Lobby, objected to 4 out of something like 21 mandated drugs on the grounds, not that they objected to contraception in general, but that 4 of those drugs they felt were abortifacient. That is, the way they worked to prevent pregnancy was actually after pregnancy had already occurred. So they would abort a fertilized egg that was already in the womb. And they brought their case to the Supreme Court, and they won. It got a lot of publicity because this was a corporation that was applying for essentially a religious freedom claim. But that's not the part that I'm interested in. So rather than an individual, right, people got really angry about this. Like, businesses don't have rights, only individuals should have rights. And the counter-argument was, of course, that people act in consort. They act in communities and as groups, and not always only individually. What's interesting to me is how the court actually approached the resolution of this question using that balancing framework that I described. And what's interesting is that the whole balancing framework actually rests on how you define the governmental interest and how that affects the least restrictive means test. So for the most part, when things get litigated like this all the way to the Supreme Court, the court is going to say, you have a religious interest that's been substantially burdened. It's an important one. And the court very frequently also says, the government has a compelling interest in executing its particular laws. So the whole case rests on, does the government have another means of executing this law that doesn't infringe on your religious freedom rights? Well, in this particular case, the majority argued Hobby Lobby won its case. So it now has an exemption from the law for those 4 contraceptives. In this case, the majority declared that the broader governmental interest of providing free contraception to all women in America who wanted them there was a least restrictive means of providing them. That is, instead of forcing the employer to participate in violation of its conscience, it could simply directly deliver the drugs to the people. Now, the dissent that disagreed with this decision said, no, that's the wrong characterization of what the governmental interest is. The governmental interest is in providing free contraception through the employer, so it narrowed the particular interest, or it broadened the interest that the government had to say that, the means that they had chosen actually was how the court should measure whether or not the government had used the least restrictive means. I think that's a circular argument, but what this tells you is that there are some major tensions in how you decide these particular cases. I'll give you another quick example, and that's a case that the Supreme Court just agreed to hear. It also has to do with the Affordable Care Act and the contraception mandate. There are quite a few organizations, mostly religious organizations, that are suing the administration right now for exemptions. And one of them is called the Little Sisters of the Poor. It's an order of nuns whose entire mission in life is to serve the elderly poor. So people who are very old and probably going to die soon and are very poor receive free care through the Little Sisters. Well, they object to, again, the contraceptive mandate. But the administration provided a certain mechanism for them to obtain what the administration calls an exemption. And that is that all they have to do is sign a piece of paper explaining to their insurance company that they should cooperate with the government in order for the government to provide the contraceptions directly and not through the Little Sisters. The government is saying it's just a piece of paper, it's utterly meaningless, you should sign it. And the Little Sisters are saying signing this would authorize the insurance company to do something that we don't agree with and we don't want to participate in this. Now, what this question brings up is tensions regarding what kinds of claims of conscience are important. So there's direct participation in something that one ethically opposes, like the administration of the death penalty, if you're a doctor and an anesthesiologist in a prison. And then there's something a little bit more indirect, like asking a nun to sign a piece of paper that authorizes a particular action. And what's fascinating about this case is that the court has to effectively enter into this debate and consider very carefully what it is that is important about claims of conscience and what constitutes a violation of something like that. And I would submit that it's very difficult to answer that question broadly and for everybody. Really, you have to enter into the particular theology of the Little Sisters and understand what their moral viewpoint is. And the courts are very reluctant to do this because they don't want to decide questions of theology. I'm going to end with a story from 1511. In 1511, Spanish conquistadores were actively enslaving and exploiting Aboriginals in the New World. The Roman Catholic Dominican friar Antonio de Montesinos, a priest, preached what became a famous sermon. The sermon denounced the injustices committed against Aboriginals in the course of the American conquest. And the sermon was the first milestone in what would become a powerful movement in favor of a more humane treatment of American Aboriginals. Montesinos said, "You are all in mortal sin. In it you live and in it you die, because of the cruelty and tyranny that you display against these innocent peoples. Do you care that they are taught the doctrine, know their God and Creator, be baptized, attend Mass, and guard feasts and Sunday? Are these not men? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not obliged to love them as you love yourselves?" Much of the case for the Aboriginals' rights were made in this kind of religious language. And one line of discussion was whether Aboriginals could be evangelized by the Dominican priests. Their missionary work was seriously obstructed by the treatment some conquistadores gave to the Aboriginals, enslaving and exploiting them. And needless to say, the conquistadores also perceived the Dominicans as an obstacle for what they wanted to do in conquering the New World. Now, suppose Montesinos had taken his case to a contemporary court. Think of the European Court of Human Rights or even the US Supreme Court. How could the issue have been framed? One could say, this case has an important religious element. Since all the applicants are missionaries and their case is expressed in religious language, let's think of it as a religious freedom case and a constitutional rights case. And from there, you could frame the issue this way. It concerns two rights or interests. On the one hand, the interests of the Spanish conquistadores, whose property rights regarding the Aboriginals are at stake. On the other hand, we have the Dominicans' interest in evangelizing the Aboriginals, a conduct prescribed by their religion, just as refraining from signing the piece of paper is prescribed by the religion of the Little Sisters of the Poor, and thus protected by the right to religious liberty. And so the real question is whether Montesinos' right to religious liberty and conscience justifies an interference with the conquistadores' right to private property. But this is an utterly absurd way to see what it is that Montesinos was trying to say. Now, why? I'll explain it in three problems and conclude there. The first problem is that the clash of rights or interests approach suggests that a choice must always be made between, on the one hand, public policy or the common good, generally represented by the law, and on the other, the claims of conscience, usually represented by some minority in the society that would never have voted the law in the first place. But this isn't always the case, and to the extent that the currently prevailing legal tests allow for some of this, that is, least restrictive means is meant to point the government toward a compromise, the legal tests still force us to make a choice, particularly if the case has gone to court. One party in a court case must always be the victor. In the case of the conquistadores versus the Dominicans, that should not bother us much. The humane religious priest who wants to rescue the enslaved should obviously win. But what about the case of the Little Sisters of the Poor? What does it mean to say that the Little Sisters' right to conscience is more important than the government's interest in providing public health care, or vice versa? I submit that it doesn't actually tell us very much. The second problem with this way of framing the question is that the clash of interests approach commensurates or equates different interests that are not actually morally equivalent. If we reduce Montesinos' claim to a claim of personal conscience, then how do we judge other such claims? Let's say that you kill someone because you think your duties to God require you to kill infidels or to sacrifice children, as some ancient tribes did do. Surely religious liberty should not prevent you from going to prison, and nor should it inhibit the state and acting to impede you to act on your plan. This leads us to the third and the last problem. Montesinos' claim that the Spanish conquistadores have to refrain from abusing the Aboriginals because he happens to hold a religious view that condemns that conduct is an extremely distorted and weak argument. When you frame it in terms of just a balancing of interests and trying to find out which is more significant, everything that's forceful in Montesinos' argument, that is, the religious and theological substance behind his argument regarding the value of every human person, and indeed who is human in the first place, is obscured. He claims that Aboriginals deserve a human treatment, and it's simply wrong to abuse them, not that his interests are more important than the interests of property rights and persons. The interest in evangelizing the Aboriginals is only one element in a more complex picture. This has nothing to do with what Montesinos wants to do himself or the actions he wants to take. It has to do with something that actually has nothing to do with personal interests. It has to do with the nature of the human person. In the center of his argument that is compelling have to do with the moral status of the Aboriginals and the injustice of their current treatment. The approach of a clash of rights and interests move these reasons completely out of the picture, and that's the last problem. As a lawyer, I like to think that everything has a legal solution, but it's clear from the story of Montesinos and the conquistadores that the law is not enough here. In the end, the law should and does express moral norms, and so we have a need for better bioethics for the reasons that Professor Taron cites. The high moral standards that religious people who are willing to dissent remind us of, religious communities and their ideas must actually be involved. And if we are to take seriously this issue, then we also have to grapple with the rise of the nones. So Pew Center research shows that increasingly people in America are identifying as nuns, as no religion, rather than as religious. This is the trend. If not first principles that religious faith offers, in which Montesinos appealed to and the Little Sisters appealed to, then what? So I would say that the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, have a responsibility to develop some other way of speaking of the value of life outside the rubric of rights balancing. Thank you.